So the first step of data analysis is defining your purpose. And so even if somebody just comes to you and says, tell me this, like general, like it's really important that you define your question, because what is that will do is that's going to define where you start looking. Because again, when you look at your data, sometimes it's just rows and rows of information, and we collect so much now that it can be really hard to start off. So what we do is when we talk about defining the question, really it's saying, what do we need to know? So what are we looking for and for what purpose? So who's asking us or why we're doing it can really influence what our question is. So if we're doing this for a proposal, right, then we know that our target audience is that donor, and we need to then collect our information to get to that goal, which is give me this money. And so how can I make my argument for the need for you to give me this money? Or for advocacy. So like, let's say that we need to this programming change and we need demonstrate that there's a need for this, then your goal is you're going to have to use your data to try to demonstrate to whoever you're targeting what that need is, and may show why that's important, not just what it is, but why it's important, and why it's important to the person who's reading it, because it's really them who's going to care, or it needs to be influenced. So you need to know what your goal is, what you're hoping to achieve when you start. So if it's just that my boss asked me for this, I mean, that's not a lofty goal, but really, why is your boss asking for it? Is it because they're being asked to figure out how we need to modify our programming? Are they being asked because they are like, what is the purpose behind that activity? And then based upon the audience, you will also adapt your presentation of this to them and your purpose. So let's say that we want to increase awareness in a community about intimate partner violence. Then the information that we are going to be collecting will be specific to, or would be applicable to, the community where we'd be presenting this, versus if we're going to the HCT or to a scientific community, we're going to want to ask our questions in a little different way that would be in line with what their expectations would be. And then once we've figured out what the question is, right? So just figuring out, so what do you want from this? Then you're going to know, basically figure out what information is needed. So if I want to figure out, let's say I want to do an advocacy paper, let's say advocacy paper on the lack of access to safe shelters for survivors. What the information I'm going to need to tell somebody what the need is. So how many people are looking for this service, maybe how many people aren't able to access this service. I'm going to need to look at, triangulate this data, like what is the money that's required to get these services in place? What are the obstacles? So you're going to bring information in from all over to try to get at what information is needed to make your argument that then somebody would say, okay, I agree, we do need this. And so what you'll do is you'll figure out what information is needed. It's kind of like what I was talking about earlier with that action plan, like put in all of the information that you might need, and then look at it and say, okay, so what do you have? What's already met? What are the gaps? Like, what information are you now going to have to go out and collect? And then how do you fill those gaps? So it's possible that maybe you don't have that information, but someone else has collected it as part of coordination. You can go and get it from there. You can look for other sources. And if it doesn't exist, then you might have to go and do an additional data collection activity. So a lot of times what you'll see for this is you'll see someone saying, do we have this in like if you're familiar with the GBVIMS, do we have this data in the GBVIMS? You can go and you can find the GBVIMS data, and it reflects, oh, we see this in the referrals that people want to go, but they can't access it. But then there's probably a next level. We need to then figure out what information do we need to show that this is really the case. And that would be like a focus group discussion or things, other activities that could then get us that qualitative data that will then also reinforce our quantitative data. Once we've identified really what, whether we've seen the trend, then we need to figure out, are there other types of information that we need to collect, or has that already been collected by an assessment done by another partner that reinforces than what we see in that quantitative data. So this is all the first step. Then this next step is the summarizing. So the first step is all in your brain or on a piece of paper. I'm really kind of trying to figure it out. Now we know our information needs. So now what you need to do is you're going to go in and you're going to get your information. You're going to mess with it. You're going to start playing with it. And this is where we group information so that we can start comparing and organizing data. Now, the good news is that most of the tools that we work with already do this for us. So if you work with Progress, this is the bottom right one here, we have those dashboards. When we say summarizing, that's just lumping like with like. So when you see a table here that says like the type of cases by status, that is putting the status is lumping likes with like. So summarizing is just putting things together. And so you can kind of think of it as making the graphs, actually. It's putting the like data with the like data so that then we can start looking at it compared to each other. Another tool that does this is the GBVIMS incident recorder. It also, those monthly statistics reports or the pivot tables, those also automatically just put together so we know how many females, how many males, the age groups. A more advanced version of this also is if we use Dataport, that also. So if you're using any of these tools, the same thing with the CPIMS Plus, not the CPIMS, the old version, is it also has some very basic summarizing functionality. So rarely, if you're using tools like this, are you going to have to manually do this. You're going to have to, if you do the data entry, it will automatically be then lumped together in some general ways. Now, if you're looking at something that's very unique, it's something you're not really, it's not something we really look at normally, then it is possible that you're going to have to generate your own graphs, or you're going to have to compile your data together to then get it together. And so then the next thing is to compare. So the comparison helps us to gain understanding of what we're looking at. So if we just have one data point, right? So if I just say this month, there were 500 unaccompanied minors who came to our services. If I have an understanding of child protection case management, perhaps that number means something to me, but actually it really means nothing without understanding the context or comparing it to something. So is 500 a lot? Maybe in one country that's crazy high, and maybe in another country that's really very small. And so what we do is to give meaning to one number, then you need to have something to compare it with. And so it allows us also to see patterns and trends. And so usually what are some of the common things that we look at when we compare? And again, this can help you think through some of those questions, those who, what, why. So we've got those descriptives, right? So now we need to think about what is influencing this? Why is this happening? And so we can start looking at, is the same thing happening for men and women? So this is a common one, is like by demographics, children and adults. Are we seeing it across the groups? Displacement status, is the same thing happening for refugees? And if you're kind of seeing the same thing happening to everybody, then maybe that's not a real big factor. If you're seeing a difference, then maybe there's something that demographic is influencing that difference. Again, it doesn't give us a complete answer, but this is how we start to identify what are these factors that are influencing what's happening to some people and other people. Another really common one is geography. So oftentimes we'll look at maybe camp versus camp, or we'll look at country versus country, or this, and to see, are we seeing the same trends globally? Are we seeing the same trends regionally? Are we seeing the same trends across camps? And then if you see a difference, then we start to think about what could cause those differences. This is much more effective closer to the data. If you were to compare something, let's say in one country to another country, unless you're looking at something very, very specific, sometimes it's really hard to infer why that difference is, because you're talking about such gigantic, so many different things that could be influencing those differences. But we see this all the time when we look at they do research, or they do the statistics on the well-being of women or children in countries, and they compare countries based upon that. That's one way. But we could also say, like, maybe we see a lot more cases in this camp than this camp, and there could be different reasons for that. Maybe there's more violence in this camp. Maybe there's more service providers in this camp, and that's why you're seeing more cases. So geography can be another reason. Services, so we can compare across services. So a lot of times we'll do this for referral. So are people accessing this service versus this service? And are there differences between those services? And then possibly the most frequent one that is used is time. So over time, do we see a difference this time last year versus this time this year? Have we seen a difference over the last 6 months? Do we see there's changing? Is there a pattern? Maybe try doing one of these comparisons with your data. So look at the time periods, look at the just different, like pick a demographic related to what you're looking at, and see if you're seeing a difference between these. And then sometimes you'll be like, obviously that makes sense. Sometimes you'll be like, that's really weird. I wonder why. And that's then when we get to this next thing, like what is causing this? And then we can start doing that additional analysis to figure out why are we seeing this, or collecting additional information if necessary. So then the fourth step is the interpretation. So this is then where we start to, so we've taken from the comparing. So now we see, okay, we see a difference between the number of cases in this camp versus this camp. But this is then where we interpret that. And again, this is the level where you could have an IMO up to the compare. You could have them, you could say, I want to compare differences, and they could give you graphs with the differences between different groups and that sort of stuff. But again, it's that interpretation is really going to require someone who understands both the subject matter and the context, because this is where you're going to draw meaning. And again, it's not perfect, right? Because you're going to interpret it based upon what the data says, but we know that our data is not perfect. We only are seeing a subset of the data. Basically, we only see information about who's coming in our doors. So that is a very specific group of people versus everybody. So we always need to consider these limitations when we're doing our interpretation. Decision making comes in here, because this is where you really then start to think about, does it make sense? This is also where, like, if you were to have bad data, right? It's possible that you're seeing something and you're like, does that make sense? It doesn't make sense at all. And you realize that people are not understanding how to collect the data or that. And obviously we don't want to assume that it's bad data, but you would go back and look to see, is there a reason why it's doing this when you know that this isn't correct? So like we oftentimes will see this like in countries, we know that globally, like 95% of individuals reporting GBV tend to be women. So when we see in a country where like 70% of the survivors are males, we'll tend to look at that and just be like, something's going on here, because that's just so significantly different than what we see everywhere else. And so we usually will then look to say, does this make sense? Like, what's going on? Are we interpreting this the same? Are we using the same language? And that's just one example, but that can happen in different words. Then this is where you also then can corroborate it. So just having your data that you've collected usually isn't enough. You want to bring in other sources of data, say, does this, like what that Save the Children report, does that, our data is backing up what they found in their assessment? And then basically what we can conclude from this. Sometimes we can say we can't come to a conclusion based upon this. So then this is where we do that. So what? So do the results suggest recommendations? So if we interpret this and if we think this is the link, then what do we want to be done? This is where we then take it again. Like I said for the last one, unless you have a report that's really doing those first 3 types of analysis, it's not probably that effective or great of a report. The same thing with these steps is that you really need to get through this interpretation and then think through, again, what was your whole purpose? And so have you given them the information at this point to then that you can then make recommendations that will then get the action that you want? So again, you're not going to modify the data. It's not like that, but it's just saying, have you actually looked at the correct data to then say, okay, and based upon this, we see this and this, recommendations would be this. So that's really what you're going to be doing in that 4th step. And again, this is all about understanding the context at this point. So these actually link together. So usually what you do is, as you're defining your purpose, and that's the step 1, you kind of you start with your question, and you should always do that. Even before you just go and start analyzing, you should say, what am I looking for? And then you summarize, and as you do that, once you've summarized or lumped your data together, you're going to then be in a position to do your descriptive analysis. So who, what, when, where, the W's, why, that's next, but the other W's. And then you start comparing. And so then you're looking at data points, and so that's that explanatory. So we see this here and we see this different here. Why? That's the why. That's the next one. And then we start to think about the interpretation. And so that's then saying we can corroborate this data with this other information, which tells us that the reason that people aren't coming is because they are afraid that they will have to report, their information won't be kept confidential. So this all comes together. So you should be thinking through, again, sometimes it's more organic, but you should make sure once you are kind of working your way through this process that you have really covered all of those different types of analysis. Because if you have, then that means you've really gone through all of these steps.